life and fiction, the show and the reality, especially in a population who has been deprived of basic education in the humanities, let alone mimetic theory, central for the development of critical thought. Hence, if members of a public have already identified with Trump in a mass-mediatized fictional reality show, they're also likely to identify with him in an equally mediatized political reality show. If they enjoyed a violent rhetoric within the show, they're likely to enjoy the same rhetoric in real life. If they were suggestible to the pathologies of exclusion as a public of The Apprentice, they're likely to have their suggestibility amplified in a crowd. The fact that the medium remains the same in the shift from entertainment to politics, and that politics is itself modeled on entertainment, confuses the reality and the show, politics and fiction. Hence, as politics is experienced as fiction, politicians are evaluated according to their dramatic performances rather than their political messages. Spectators of the reality show at Trump's rallies might thus have aesthetic rather than political criteria in mind, as their mimetic unconscious might lead them to ask, could I identify with the protagonist? Did he make me feel good? Or if I feel far from good, did his accusations against minority at least make me feel better and subordinate others worse? Above all, would I want to watch this show on television again tomorrow? And as I think of the next show, doesn't America already begin to feel great again? Perhaps then, shows like The Apprentice paved the way for the election of an apprentice president in real life, after all. Lastly, we might still wonder, was the desire to beat Trump triggered by what he has? Or is the other way around, the identification or mimesis directing desire? If Freud argued that desire for an object, his term for a woman, most notably the mother, precedes identification with a model or father figure, and Girard, in an inversion of perspective, stressed that identification with the model actually directs the desire toward the object. The case of Trump seems to me to blur the line between these two distinct emotional ties, as Freud called them, insofar as both the desire to be and to have simultaneously constitutive of the mimetic pathos he triggers. As the name capitalized on his towers makes visible for all to see, Trump is indeed both the name of a subject and of an object. The brand plastered on objects being so constitutive of the subject that it cannot be dissociated from what he is. Why identify with such a figure otherwise, I wonder? Spectators who voters who identify with Trump do so because of what he has, which already defines what he is, and what they would like to be, have as well. From Trump Tower to Trump golf courses, Trump casinos to Trump beauty pageants, Trump wine to Trump steaks, to whatever other objects he owns, an untidy intermixture of wanting to be and wanting to have is at play in the mimetic pathos that ties the leader to his crowd of supporters, trumping the fundamental distinction on which Freud's account of mass psychology rests. There is a logical potential in this pathological case, after all. It is a case that indicates that both wanting to have and wanting to be are at play in emerging forms of mass-mediatized suggestibility to mimetic pathos that rests on the interplay between the public and the crowd. To answer Schwager's timely question, then, we may not need scapegoats individually if we are endowed with a basic sense of moral respect for human or to human others. But collectively, and in time of crisis, new fascist leaders will continue to steer violent mass emotions against innocent scapegoats as a shortcut to rise to power. Counting on the mirroring reflexes that leads humans to effectively respond to the mimetic pathos of the actors, this actors-turned-master can now rely on new media in order to cast a spell on the public and disseminate the pathologies of exclusion with an increasing speed and power of infection. If scapegoating mechanisms are far from new, this interplay between hyperreal simulations and mimetic hypnotization may actually be the new side of new fascism. In fact, in this process of spiraling circulation, the distinction between reality and show, fiction and politics, but also truth and lies, origin and copy, digital simulations and embodied imitation becomes part of what I call a hypermimetic dynamic that thrives on simulations that may appear comic from a virtual distance, yet, as any witness of children imprisoned in detention camps, both in the US and Europe, can experience trigger tragic pathos in real life. To conclude then, despite the innovation in the media, the old concept of mimesis remains strikingly relevant to account for the violent message against others that are constantly at play in contemporary politics. If, as I've argued, all countries are vulnerable to the pathologies of exclusion, then it is urgent for mimetic theory to continue developing critical patho-logies to diagnose and counter new fascist phantoms looming on the horizon. At the same time, and our humanity may hinge on this, we should also promote communal movements of solidarity across national, cultural, and religious differences, a mimetic solidarity which, I did not stress it enough, is also constitutive of Homo mimeticus. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nidesh, for this inspiring and over 100 years spanning lecture. I think we have a lot of stuff to discuss, and we move over to the desk, and we'll open then the discussion.
Okay. Wolfgang, where is he? Oh, Wolfgang, where are you? Oh.
The man back.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech. That was very interesting. And I would like to point out a parallel perspective on this subject matter of the resurrection of fascism. That is something that we, excuse me? Okay. That is something that we discussed with our group of study in Milan. That is the resurrection of fascism among young Italian students, which is something which I personally experience very often as a high school teacher. It often happens during the narrative of history class, that when I explain the history about Mussolini and the fascism, students usually tend to identify with Mussolini and fascism and usually support it. And I noticed that this happens often with students with lower grades, students that feel themselves as marginalized in some way. And I started to think that maybe this happens because they perceive as something like an identification of themselves with Mussolini as the victim, with Mussolini as the figure that has been marginalized or expelled, upon which fall a taboo of exclusion from the intellectual elite that won the war. That's their narrative. This narrative prompts an identification with the victim in this narrative, that is Mussolini, that prompts the resurrection of fascism. So my question is, how do we deal in a narrative to young people of this subject matter of the negative depiction that we give righteously of fascism, with the risk that it prompts another identification and a greater identification of the youngsters, of the youngster that feel themselves as marginalized, as a figure that did not reach a role in society, with the scapegoated Mussolini in their intuition?
It's an interesting question. It's interesting to me because I didn't grow up in Italy, but I grew up in the Italian part of Switzerland, and as I was a child, the term fascista was considered, a worse accusation. So there would be no identification possible without necessarily knowing the history of fascism, but the culture still mediated. I guess the proximity to the Second World War was still mediating the fact that no identification was there. And so it indicates, I think, a radical historical shift in Italian culture. Because I don't know at what level of education you're speaking. high school. So nonetheless, students who are getting ready for the university, who already have a certain historical baggage and a certain historical knowledge mediated, hopefully in secondary school. So the first response is that something seemed to have gone wrong at the level of secondary education, because an identification with Mussolini as a victim, I mean, indeed, there are infinite victims in the history of humanity. Why identify with Mussolini? It seems that education is, within the schools, is just one of the sources of information for new generations growing up in the digital age, and that what they see on television, the speeches they hear from contemporary politicians have a stronger impact. So I don't have any answers, but it seems symptomatic of a certain loss of power within educative structures to mediate a basic sense of history that sets the ground for identifications on a moral historical basis. And how do you deal with it? By teaching history and by showing what fascism led to and the proximity between fascism and Nazism, and whether they could identify with that kind of politics, and try to render it as close and personal as possible. I think that very often the difficulty in teaching history is that it's perceived as kind of facts and dates and things that happened long ago, and if you can read stories, Primo Levi, and have the perspective of the victim read by students, it would be a starting point for a shift in identification. But it's interesting what you say. I wasn't aware of that.
Next back.
Thank you for your work. You've drawn a very fine line about certain groups in modern society imitating the dynamics of fascist models, but excluding the third part of your presentation, which is a story of its own, so the first two parts. Wouldn't you agree that if you just change a few terms, you'd have the same presentation, so like the identical rise of shadow of communism in leaders like Bernie Sanders and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and so basically the Democratic Party 2020 field has this vibe, a radical vibe, which is very similar, just on the other side of the spectrum. And you have this happening in just other groups in the world. Wouldn't you agree that this is like very similar? So you just have to change the few terms and you've got the same straight presentation with the same problems of rising of politicians and groups which offer like simplistic answers to very complex and historical problems, and like very simple answers to problems of a global scale.
Yes, and in a way that's why I want to avoid using the term populism, because it conflates, I think, two political movements that should not be grouped under the same category. Indeed, we could say that both Trump and Bernie Sanders are populist, and yet I think it does matter that within one version of the so-called populism that I group under the rubric of new fascism, you have a certain content. It's not only a question of rhetoric. I try to question both the content and the rhetoric, in the sense that the machismos, the racism, the anti-immigration, the promotion of the super rich, and the appeal to a frustrated middle class, the appeal to a frustrated middle class can be shared, and there are elements that can be shared between, the populist and the new fascists, but the constitutive elements of what Umberto Eco calls Urfascism allow for a difference of content. They would say yes. The question and the difficulty for populism on the left are to indeed use a form of rhetoric that speaks to people and use it for what we could call a positive mimesis, a contagion that is positive and based on certain human principles. The difference, I draw the difference, and I think I prefer to use the term new fascism, putting those brackets, first of all, to say, let's look at the continuities at the level of, the rhetoric and see if what happens in the past can help us avoid problems, similar problems and resurgence in the present, but also to suspend the kind of question and say, could it be, that Trump is not a fascist, yes, certainly not a fascist, but they could move towards a fascist politics. And the content, if we take the definitions, the classical definitions of fascism, are indeed there. And I would argue that those contents that have to do with, as I said, militarism, racism, xenophobia, machismo, and so forth, distinguish it from the populist on the left. Hence the need of a different terminology, also not to say, oh, well, they're populists, and it could be on the left and on the right, and it's all the same, it's all appealing to the crowds. I don't think it's the same. I think it's fundamentally different, and politically we see it. Denial of climate change or awareness of climate change makes a political difference. Health insurance for everybody and education for everybody and only for the super rich makes a radical difference. There should be, a military critic by training, there should be a different name for that phenomenon. And I think that fascism might be excessive, but might at least trigger the a kind of alarm and receptive system to say, okay, let's be careful here. Let's be alert. Let's not call it with the same name. Because there are really two different contents, two different politics.
Yeah, I have 5 people on my list. First, Sandy, then Luca, Martha, Maura, and Chris. Someone else?
Sure. Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Lots of issues to think about. When you mentioned Freud and Girard, I thought you were going to talk a little bit more about suggestion, and I thought perhaps you would talk about Charcot and this kind of Lacan before the fact, who existed in Paris that Freud went to Paris to see. And there's a very famous painting that is often associated with this period by André Bouillet in 1887, where it's a painting entitled Une leçon de Docteur Charcot, la Pétrière, Salpêtrière. And some people have argued that there's a kind of picture of Freud in there. It's a picture of a woman being treated by Charcot, who is we know to be an actress, Blanche Whitman. And so Frank Soloway has kind of brought forth this particular painting, and he suggests that really suggestion is really the foundation for transference, which becomes so important for Freud's method. So I'm wondering if you have more to say about that. Seems to be to add to what you're doing.
Thanks so much for that question. Indeed, there would be much more to say about Freud. Conflicted and in that relationship with Charcot, he went to the Salpêtrière, Freud, and he was very impressed by Charcot as a figure and his legendary Leçons du Mardi, where that particular painting, you're referring to, is depicting. So Freud was very interested in hypnosis. He not only attended Charcot lessons, but he also translated Hippolyte Bernheim's book, Suggestive Therapeutics, which is a book on hypnosis. Now, there was a rivalry between the school of Charcot and the Salpêtrière and the school of Nancy, where Bernheim was the main figure. And the main difference was that for Charcot, hypnosis was a pathological manifestation linked to hysteria, whereas Bernheim of the School of Nancy argued that hypnosis is a general condition of the human brain and that even very intelligent people can be hypnotized. So he didn't pathologize hypnosis. And Freud's position is not as clear, but what is clear is that over time he takes distance from his master Charcot and from that tradition and develops a different notion of the unconscious, which is based on the repressive hypothesis and so forth. But as you rightly point out, the notion of transference is very, very close to the notion of hypnotic suggestion. And you rightly mentioned Salavai, it's an important book. I would also argue for mimetic theory, Mikkel Borch-Jacobsen's work on Freud is particularly attentive in tracing the continuities between Freud and the hypnotic tradition, and I rely and engage with his work. But yes, it's an interesting story because, in my view, Freud's decision to break with the hypnotic tradition also erased the tradition of what I call the mimetic unconscious, which I link to suggestion. In that painting that you're referring to, there is an unknown assistant of Charcot in the painting. I don't think there is Freud, but there is a physician named Charles Ferré. And Charles Ferré, who is in the painting, is the figure that Nietzsche quotes when he is arguing that there is a way of communicating which is not based on language but on mimicry, and that mimicry generates then gestures generate mimicry that generate thoughts. And that is strikingly close to what figures like Rizzolatti and Gallese are arguing. So indeed, that connection, I'm interested in articulating that connection with a pre-Freudian theory of the mind, because I argued that they were very aware of what now is grouped under the rubric of mirror neurons. And their psychology was an intersubjective embodied psychology that I think is coming back in the neurosciences, and that in mimetic theory we are well positioned to engage with. So thank you for your question.
Luca, next.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. I'd like to push you a little bit on the notion of the digital crowds. If you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because the images you showed us of Le Bon, for instance, we think of the crowd as people in a square, there's a leader talking to them from a balcony, and it's a quite, one-directional, passive, it's all acting very quickly. If I think of digital crowds, I think of hordes of people on Facebook and Twitter who exchange messages. The thing is not that passive in that kind of environment, because people exchange ideas. They have also the possibility to search for information. So if you like, there could be also more sort of critical stance that then does not necessarily escape the hoarding and the fact that they all eventually repeat the same argument of the master. So how has the concept of the crowd changed? First question. And second related question, we tend to associate the crowd, at least from your presentation, as something possibly negative, because it kind of denies individuality, it denies personality. But again, if we think of crowds organized through the internet, through Facebook as a tool of resistance, I'm thinking of the spark of the Egyptian revolution, for instance. One of the first instances was this Facebook page that was created on this person, Khaled Said, who had been killed and tortured by the Egyptian police. His photo was published, the banner was "We are all Khaled Said," and people gathered there, exchanged ideas, and then they organized themselves in a crowd that actually was in the street. So can there be also positive crowds there?
Thanks so much. These are very important questions, and I'm glad you asked them, because I try to address them in the book. It's true, I emphasized the negative side, and my sense is that the evaluation of the crowd is the same as the evaluation of mimesis. That is, it's always double-faced. It's always what Derrida would call a pharmacon. It can be a poison and a remedy, depending on the models that are in power. That's why I emphasize the negative, because of the case study at hand. But you're absolutely right in stressing the positive as well. With respect to the crowd and the new media, that's a very interesting question, because Le Bon argued that we entered into the age of crowds. And Tarde, after Le Bon stated that, corrected it, and he said, we're actually entering the age of publics. And that was in the 1900s, so 110 years ago. And he defined the public as a virtual crowd. That is, a crowd that doesn't need to be assembled physically, but that can be scattered across different kind of temporal and spatial distances, but are subjected to the same medium. His example were newspapers. So his example was the fact that we are in our living rooms reading the same newspaper generate a public, a virtual crowd. And a simple fact of being exposed at the same time to the same information will generate a mental connection, which he calls virtual, that will allow for a certain contagion to take place without physical contact. And I think that that model is kind of useful to account for the digital turn, in which indeed, it's not a question of contagion at the physical level, but it's a type of contagion that is virtual, and that, well, it's way beyond what Tard imagined. Tard worried about a day in which people would read only one newspaper. We used to read many books. Sometimes we read newspapers, and now people might read only newspaper, or maybe only one. And now the information comes from Twitter. So what would I have said about an age in which the information comes from Twitter? The danger there that bubbles are created, in which the information that we get is generated by algorithms that feed you the kind of ideology that is based on the network that we share, and so targets specifically what we are already predisposed to believe. And so the power of suggestion with the new media, and I talk about that in the book, is in my view amplified to the nth degree. The simple fact that we are fed and reinforced in our ideological belief on the right and on the left. So it's a danger on both parties, and I think that it requires new attention and an attempt to study that in the book. So thanks for asking that question. I think it always goes both ways, mimesis. So indeed, the question for politicians is how to put mimetic behavior to kind of positive, sympathetic contagion. And contagion itself is neither negative nor positive. It's the kind of message that is channeled through it that determines the effects.
Next, Martha.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very thoughtful, intriguing, and I appreciated the comparison very much of Freud and Girard. I wanted to ask you about something I was quite struck by in your choice of language. And I guess in some ways it goes back to that painting we were just discussing in terms of the woman in the theater of observation being the object of the male gaze in a way that's quite uncomfortable, actually, for a lot of women to look at that image. So what interests me is that I appreciate that you're saying Freud focused too much on the individual, but I think it's important to say that we want to look at micro and macro levels, not simultaneously, but not as alternatives where we forget one. So what I was struck by was your language of having and being, because Lacan, as you know, also starts with a lack of being as essential human problem, and so he and Girard share that focus on lack. And the way that Lacan suggests the world is organized is in terms of that structure of having and being. So where you said that one wants to have what the model has, and that leads to wanting to be the model. Lacan divides that up and says that in the classic relationship, the heterosexual, straight, we would say, relationship, men have the phallus and women are the phallus, and that becomes a model at that interdividual level that then is duplicated more largely in society. It seems that's highly relevant to fascism because of the historical association of fascism with certain kinds of sexual dynamics. So the pornography as exploding under conditions of fascism, a president who now has 22 credible accounts of assault. If you look at The Apprentice itself, it was men versus women, and very much the male gaze. I mean, there were women who were there I mean, you could just say The Apprentice was the group portrait of men having the phallus and women being the phallus, and all appealing to the leader, the ultimate leader in that sort of phallic brigade, which would be Trump. So how would you see that the level that you've been working on might be differentiated? And one last example, in the United States and Canada, there have been, I don't know if any of the cases have come from Europe, I haven't tracked them, but the incels and voluntary celibates who have been associated with mass shootings, and they're very much on the internet, and they are linked to white supremacy and to violence against women, and they've become heroes to other incels once they participate in one of these mass shootings of women. So how you would work that particular perspective into your larger picture is what I'm interested in.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, the distinction between having and being, it's one that Freud sets up in the group psychology book. In the chapter 7 on identification, he makes the distinction between object catexis, wanting to have, and identification, wanting to be. Those are his terms. And the reason I zoom in there, it's because Girard does a great reading of group psychology and analysis of the ego in Violence and the Sacred. And I think that his reading is so detailed and persuasive because he has read Freud, more than Lacan, very, very carefully. It's an inversion. My reading is that the Girardian model with respect to these two emotional ties, it's an inversion in which he posits mimesis before desire. And I think that model is very persuasive, the Girardian inversion of Freudianism, because it leads to the mimetic theory we know of. Now, my question is, at the kind of theoretical level of this talk and via the case study of Trump, does it still apply, really? And Lacan, I didn't find him so useful because he is part of a structuralist moment in which the unconscious is structured like a language. He also moves away from the hypnotic tradition following Freud, and is very faithful to Freud in that sense. But I found useful a collaborator, or someone who was very close to Lacan, that was Georges Bataille. So I have a chapter on Bataille precisely for the question of sexuality that you're pointing out. And maybe there is a way of working Lacan in it. I have done it via Bataille. And in Bataille, this notion of contagion is indeed central to an essay that is titled La structure psychologique du fascisme, the psychological structure of fascism. It's one of the first essays on fascism, certainly in France and in Europe with Reich's book on the crowd in the 1930s, early 30s. And he is attentive to the movements of attraction and repulsion that object subject matter, including sexuality, generate. And I thought it works very, very well to account for what is going on right now. I mean, with the case of Trump, why is this objection not simply generating repulsion, but seems to paradoxically work in his favor after, case after case after case? And I think that Bataille can offer us a key. The reason I go to Bataille is because Bataille, I argue, remains tied to this tradition of the unconscious I call the mimetic unconscious. There is an embodied, visceral unconscious that doesn't set up a distinction between wanting to have and wanting to be, but is attentive to a pathos that flows, and he calls it communication. But indeed, that doesn't preclude working Lacan into it as well, so somebody should do it.
I have 6 people on the list, then I have to close. I cut myself off, there are 5. So next is Maura. Please keep your questions short and precise.
In your presentation, you were pointing to fascism as always having a leader. And currently in the cyber crowd that we're dealing with, some of it seems leaderless. So can you look at, is there a way to analyze the function of the cyber crowd in a slightly different way? Or are they still very much aligning with a leader that perhaps is hidden or is strictly an instigator and steps away to let the mob do what the mob will do?
Yeah, right. One of the definitions of fascism is indeed this emotional rapport with a strong leader, with an authoritarian, prestigious leader who mobilizes the emotion and embodies the state, right, the head of the body politic. And well, in the case studies that I looked at, it seems to me that even in the cyber world, a leader is nonetheless still necessary. The cyber is a supplement in which the leader then can tweet and the media can amplify the figure, but it's part of the problem of a politics that seems to hinge very much on the personality of the politician, especially in the US, but also in Europe, that seems to require the figure of a leader, even in a cyber world. So I wouldn't be able to comment on a kind of contagion that is deprived of leaders. I haven't seen or I haven't studied it yet. Maybe you have a specific case study in mind? No. Yeah. It doesn't mean that it's not to come, but what I learned from the neurosciences is that the presence of a body on a stage, and what Nietzsche calls the actor, in a mise-en-scène that centralizes and protects emotional energy is still very, very much important. And I would be surprised if you can do away in the near future with leader figures in order to generate fascist movements. But I may be wrong.
Chris?
Yes, I wanted to say that one parallel to what you're doing is a famous essay written in the late 30s by Kenneth Burke called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, in which he tried to figure out how the dark magic of Hitler's wordplay worked. So my question is, what specific tactics would you recommend to Trump's opponents to counter the dark magic of this new personality?
Yeah, I think there is this notion that I take from Nietzsche of pathos of distance that I use to structure my thought around mimesis. It's a double movement. And the first movement is to take critical distance, what we try to do at conferences like this. So why does it work? What is the rhetoric behind it? Why is it effective? Let's take it seriously. Let's analyze it. Let's not dismiss it as just magic, because the magic has a kind of, dramatic logic behind it. So taking distance and even in classrooms and kind of studying rhetoric, not only for the content of the speeches, which might be ridiculous, but also for what I try to pay attention to, the mise-en-scène, the repetitions, the gestures, the mimicry and all of that. And kind of bringing that in conversation with the neurosciences, mimetic theory, and figures like Burke who were attentive to that early on. As a literary critic, he was ahead of the game, I think. So I'm glad you bring him up. That would allow for some form of distance. But I think that critical distance, what we call a masking operation. I think Girard hermeneutics seem very much in line with Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, unmasking, how it works, taking distance. I don't think it's sufficient to counter a new leader. You need a positive program as well. And that's something that I discussed with William Connolly, that book that I mentioned, Aspirational Fascism. I end my book on New Fascism with a dialogue with William Connolly. And we both agree that on the left, what is required is a positive view of a positive rhetoric of mimetic contagion. That we cannot simply assume that humans are only rational creatures. The affect needs to be worked through the rhetoric of the left as well. And that's why I think it's important on the one hand to keep a distinction between populism and fascism or new fascism, but at the same time, populism should not shy away from using rhetorical strategies that might appear to share some of the elements of the far right, and put them to productive, liberating, and sympathetic political use, precisely because mimesis goes both ways. And that when I said, that the project of Mimeticus goes back to Plato, I really meant it, to this notion of the pharmacon, that Derrida analyzed and that is there in Girard as well. Right? There is no essence of mimesis. There are always two sides, both a poison and a therapy, and learning to use it as a therapy, I think, is part of the difficulty these days. But something that we need to learn.
Nikki?
Okay, I had a very similar question as Chris had, so I can follow up here. Now, you had this one quote that I found very striking that said, if you are in this contagion and if you are in this crowd, the leader, he should never use rational arguments. And so, on the one hand, I think you're right, we need a positive contagion, but it's not positive if it's just the same kind of making people slaves and doing everything the leader says. So it needed to be, to account for the emotions, but it would have to be a contagion that left room for rationality. But on the other hand, this quote says it's not possible.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
how do you go in between? How do you do that?
I'm not advocating Le Bon as a model of, political, as a political theorist that should be applied à la lettre. I think Le Bon there is useful to account for the rhetoric on the far right, which indeed doesn't use reason, just affirmation. But I absolutely agree with you. Or if you want to recuperate the visceral register, as Connolly calls it, I call it the mimetic register, we need to have reasons as well. And that's where I would put the difference between, once again, populism and new fascism. I think that somebody like Bernie Sanders works rational arguments in his rhetoric in a way that someone like Trump doesn't. And I think that is essential. Once again, for this pathos of distance. The distance of reason should be mobilized at the same time as the emotions. And it's not an either-or kind of choice. So thanks for allowing me to clarify. I'm not advocating Le Bon. I'm just showing that what it says was appropriated by both Hitler and Mussolini in the 20s and 30s, and might still be relevant to understand why a certain rhetoric on the far right works, but I'm not advocating that as a political solution, no.
The man behind wheel.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to come back on your reply to Mattia about the problem of fascism spreading among young students in Italy. Basically, you replied that Italian teachers, the Italian educational system should teach better history on relying more on historical facts. I think that's one part of the problem. It's not enough. Actually, Le Bon, in the crowd, there is a passage in which he writes, we should not trust history books, and actually I agree. We should not trust history books. I mean, we should not trust them too much. I think we should trust more mimetic theory. So I think my question is, why should not we consider Benito Mussolini as a victim of a scapegoat mechanism and fascism as an object of intellectual, cultural expulsion? I mean, the situation was this: there was a nation on the edge of a civil war. Italy was defeated. There was crisis, a lot of different type of crises. There have been a brutal lynching in Piazzale Loreto. Mussolini and others died by hands of a crowd. And after that, we have a principle of a source of legitimacy that is our constitution, that is our Italian Republic. So I would like to ask why we should not consider that case just a case of scapegoat.
I mean, considering Mussolini a scapegoat under the current government, I mean, the question is what is at stake, in going back to Mussolini and considering us a scapegoat now that the Lega is kind of gaining in power and that anti-immigration laws are in place, that a certain racism is openly advocated. I think that the stakes are not so much, whether Mussolini himself served a certain scapegoating function at a certain, historical moment, but what is the recuperation that is being done when we want to consider him a scapegoat? And I would argue that history remains important in the understanding of the present. What I tried to do in this book on New Fascism was not go back and give an historical account of fascism. That's been done thousands of times, but what do we do with what we know from the past in the present? So I'll be interested in seeing, I would ask my student, okay, let's analyze some contemporary speeches from the Lega, and let's see, do more than arguing is it a scapegoat or not, and see the scapegoating mechanism at play there, which are rather obvious. So I agree with you that mimetic theory, is important, but I think it doesn't exclude historical knowledge, and so I wouldn't blame the teachers either. I would say that it's very difficult to be a teacher in the 21st century where the source of information come from elsewhere, and so it's a question of resistance and education. But I guess it depends on, I think it's good to engage with the students and ask what is at stake for them. Why is it important to consider, Mussolini scapegoat? And then follow up, is Hitler a scapegoat too? How far do we go with this logic? And their history, I think, is essential because it's important to make distinctions, I think. So I don't have a formula on that, but I would remain on the question of historical awareness as an important aspect of the distancing critical effect, and then working on the pathos as well. What is there at play in contemporary students in identifying with Mussolini? Why that identification now? And work from there. Maybe just a follow-up on that, very briefly. I was teaching Heart of Darkness for many years, and very often I taught it in relationship to Apocalypse Now, which is closer, and I was in the US, so it was closer to the students. And so one of the questions that I asked when I was teaching Apocalypse Now was, in the Rite of the Valkyries scene, do students identify with the Vietnamese or with the American soldiers? And I asked the question because the film is structured so to elicit an identification, paradoxically, for a film that is against the Vietnam War. It's a critique. But the way the film is shot, and Vittorio Storaro did the cinematography, the way it's shot, it elicits an identification with the helicopters. And acknowledging that identification seemed to me important in order then to take distance. So I'm not against, blocking identifications with oppressors. I think it's a first step in order to take distance. And in that sense, yes, it's a good point.
Final question.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me onto the list. And thank you also very much for the lecture, which I found extremely impressive, profound, and important. I'm just, as the questions went on, I just became more and more worried about something that I already heard when you were talking, and now it became very clear to me that there is something that is somewhat worrying to me in any case. And this is this too easy, what I consider, I'll just put it like that for the moment, too easy acceptance of the pharmakon, as you put it, the good and the bad contagion, good and bad mimesis. And the problem was to some extent addressed here when, with the previous comment saying, but there must be room for rational argument. You cannot reduce, say, your positive, your left, or your progressive politics to another form of mimesis. Then that must be based at least partly on rational argument. So the problem was at least seen there in that question. I don't think really raised pertinently enough, because of two reasons. That within this kind of understanding of politics as heavily reliant on dynamics of contagion and processes of mimesis, the level of rationality that is kind of drawn in or relied upon on the side will always be difficult to assess. Yeah, it will be very, diffused. It will not be clear. It will not be based on the argumentative basis of that politics will not be clear. It will never be clear enough. Yeah? Now, this is, of course, one doesn't want to become a complete Platonist. I agree fully. Already Aristotle agreed insist that it's not just what you say, but you have to know how to say it. You know, the ancient tradition of rhetoric is very much related to what I think you're saying. But still, you know, I do think the challenge of politics, or for progressive Enlightenment politics of our time, is to what extent we can avoid going too deep into this mode of the political that is based on the dynamics of contagion and mimesis, and how quickly we can extract ourselves from it again, because if the progressives are going to start playing the same game because it's the effective game in town, I think we're heading for big disaster.
Yeah, it's an important point, and I think that one of the things that struck me when I was teaching in the US and paying attention to the way the elections work there is the length of the election. You know, just a process that's more than a year, and the degree of spectacle that is involved in that process. And I was struck by it because I was not used to it, and so maybe I emphasized the necessity to counter this affective strategy, and I should contextualize it better and say, within the US context in which politics seems so much to hinge on a certain logic of what I call fiction or entertainment, then it is necessary to engage with it. But ideally, yes, ideally we should step back and really, you know, not rely, or rely as little as possible on the register of emotions, because once we are there, indeed, it's very difficult to articulate the logos. I don't want to set up a clear-cut distinction between the logos and the pathos. I think that they are related, but I think I stick to the notion of pharmacon because it's a question of dosage. And in homeopathic quantities, I think that it can still be beneficial to put the affective to a progressive enlightening use in homeopathic doses. One of the aspects that developed out of this book was an evaluation of comedy, for instance. You know, the fact that satirical shows that are on the left, that are very critical of Trump, are indeed using emotions, positive emotions, in order to critique, right, power. And I worry about that, precisely because of the notion of the question of dosage. It's a daily show. It's every day a joke. Everything is a joke. And so we can easily laugh. And politics should not be only about laughter. Or once we are pulled into the logic of pathos, then it's difficult to generate hierarchies and distinction about subjects that should be subjected to comedy and some that are not, and should be discussed dispassionately. So I agree with you. Thanks for that observation.
Thank you very much, Nidesh, for your inspiring and passionate lecture. And thank you, the audience, for your patience and your engagement in the discussion. It's about 10 o'clock. Still, almost everyone is here. So now the day, an inspiring day is at the end. Have a good night, and we see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.